June 17, 2020, Trinity College, Dublin. A team of geneticists makes an announcement about a skull fragment that's been sitting in storage for decades, a piece of bone labeled NG10, recovered from the very center of Newgrange in County Meath, Ireland. A monument that's been standing for over 5,000 years. The announcement is simple. The man this skull belonged to was the product of incest. His parents were either siblings or a parent and child. And the team's conclusion went further than that. They said this wasn't just a strange family. This was evidence of a ruling class, a dynasty, the kind of inbred royal bloodline you see in Egyptian pharaohs, in Inca god kings, buried at the heart of the most important tomb in Irish prehistory. For 5 years, that's been the story. It's in documentaries. It's on plaques. If you've ever watched a video about Newgrange, there's a good chance someone told you with total confidence that you were looking at the tomb of an incestuous god king. But here's where it gets strange. In 2025, almost exactly 5 years later, almost to the week, a different team published a direct response to that finding. Researchers from the University of York and University College Dublin went back through the evidence, and what they found wasn't a confirmation. It was a reversal. They pointed out something simple and slightly embarrassing. Newgrange wasn't excavated carefully in some pristine, undisturbed state. The interior had been dug through, disturbed, and rearranged for centuries before archaeologists got there properly in the 1960s, which means nobody can actually say, with confidence, where NG10 was originally placed or what that placement meant. And when this new team looked at the genetic relationships between people buried across Ireland's passage tombs, the pattern didn't look like a tight royal bloodline at all. It looked like distant relatives, second cousins, the kind of relatedness you'd expect in any small community, not a dynasty. Somewhere right now, there's a museum sign in the Boyne Valley telling visitors they're standing in the tomb of an incestuous king. And the science behind that sign has already been quietly walked back by the people who study this for a living. If you've ever wondered where you actually come from, not the family story, but the real, traceable, biological answer, that question is exactly what this video is going to answer. And I think you're going to want to stick around for it, because what we're about to get into goes a lot deeper than one skull in one tomb. Because here's the thing. If the single most famous genetic discovery in Irish history can get reversed in 5 years, what does that mean for everything else we think we know about who actually built this place and who their descendants actually are? The thing every Newgrange documentary tells you with total confidence? According to the people who discovered it, it's now believed to be backwards. Actually, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever taken one of those consumer DNA ancestry tests? Or even thought about it? Just answer in your head or drop it in the comments. Because by the end of this video, that little result on your report, the one most people skim past, is going to mean something very different to you. Backwards is generous, honestly. Around 2500 BCE, about 1,000 years after Newgrange was sealed shut, something new starts showing up along the Atlantic coast of Ireland. Pottery, a very specific shape, wide at the top, narrowing toward the bottom, like an upside-down bell. Archaeologists call this the Beaker culture, named after that exact shape. And when geneticists started sequencing remains from this period, they found something that should have been a much bigger headline than it was. The male genetic lineages that had been in Ireland up until this point. The lineages of the people who built Newgrange start disappearing from the record, not slowly. Within a few centuries, they're almost gone. Laura Cassidy's team at Trinity College Dublin had been working through ancient Irish genomes for years by this point. And in 2016, they sequenced the remains of a man buried on Rathlin Island off the coast of Antrim, dated to around 2000 BCE. His Y chromosome carried a marker called R1b. That marker is in roughly 84% of Irish men alive today. 84%. From a population that shows up around 2500 BCE, 1,000 years after the people most associated with ancient Irish heritage had already built their biggest monuments. What they found next changed everything about how this story is usually told. Because the population most people picture when they think ants in Ireland, the Newgrange builders, barely shows up in that 84%. The dominant lineage in Irish men today doesn't trace back to them. It traces back to the people who arrived after them. And this is a population that reshaped the genetic makeup of an entire island. It's the majority ancestry of Irish men walking around right now. And it doesn't have a name that anyone outside of a research paper would recognize. A migration that gave most living Irish men their Y chromosome, and almost nobody can tell you where it actually started. It began further away than that paper makes it sound. About 5,000 years ago, far from Ireland, on the grasslands north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, In what's now southern Russia and Kazakhstan, a population archaeologists call the Yamnaya start moving. They have wagons, they have horses, and they start moving west in large numbers. David Reich's team at Harvard has spent years tracing what happens next using genome-wide data from across Europe. And what they found is that this Yamnaya-related ancestry doesn't just nudge into Europe, it sweeps across it. Within a few centuries, it shows up in the corded ware cultures of Central Europe, and from there, it reaches the Bell Beaker populations along the Atlantic coast, including Ireland. From the steppe north of the Caspian Sea to a hillside in County Antrim is about 2,500 miles. And the genetic evidence suggests that distance, generation by generation, was covered in well under 1,000 years. That's not slow drift. That's fast. Faster than almost anything that came before it in that region. Here's the part that should land differently depending on where you're from. If you're Irish or you have Irish ancestry, and you've ever seen R1b on a DNA test, specifically the subbranch called R1bL21, the one concentrated most heavily in Donegal, that line goes directly back through this, back through the wagons, back to a population that had never even seen the Atlantic Ocean. This isn't just ancient history. This is in your DNA right now. And here's where it gets genuinely strange. The identity most people associate with Ireland, the language, the culture, the word Celtic, that didn't arrive with this migration. This wave wasn't Celtic. Nobody on those wagons would have recognized that word. But genetically, this is the wave that actually shaped the population. The Celtic label gets attached to something that comes much, much later. And the implication here isn't abstract. This is a direct, traceable line from a specific population on the Pontic steppe to a genetic marker carried by millions of Irish people today, including, statistically, a good number of the people watching this right now. If this migration had stalled, if it had just not happened, the dominant ancestry of modern Ireland wouldn't exist. The population most people assume is the original Irish is actually the population that got replaced. Replaced is where most videos on this topic would stop. It's not where this one stops. By around 2000 BCE, the genetic picture in Ireland settles down. The steppe-derived ancestry that arrived with the Beaker culture is now dominant. The earlier Neolithic ancestry, the ancestry of the Newgrange builder, is still there, but only as a small minority component. And this picture doesn't change much for the next several thousand years. There's a project called the Irish DNA Atlas. Researchers based in Dublin spent years mapping the fine-scale genetic structure of the modern Irish population. And what they confirmed is that the genetic landscape of Ireland today, the one you'd see if you tested a random sample of people across the country, was basically locked in during this Bronze Age period, about 3,500 years ago. So mystery solved, right? The real ancestors of modern Ireland are this Bronze Age, steppe-derived population. They arrived around 2500 BCE. They replaced the Newgrange builders, and that's the story. Case closed. Except the Yamnaya, that steppe population at the very root of this whole migration, weren't some untouched original population either. Genome studies show the Yamnaya themselves formed from a mixing of two earlier groups, Eastern European hunter-gatherers, and a population related to the Caucasus region. And that mixing happened only a few thousand years before the Yamnaya started their own expansion, westward. So there's no point in this chain where you can put your finger down and say, this is where it starts. Not the Newgrange builders, not the Beaker arrivals, not even the Yamnaya themselves. Every population in this story is the result of an earlier replacement, every single one. And once you sit with that for a second, the question stops being, who were the ancient Irish? It becomes something much bigger. Because the idea of a pure or original population for any place, anywhere, including wherever you're sitting right now, might not survive contact with the data either. There is, though, a living version of this story, and it's closer than you'd think. County Donegal, northwest coast of Ireland. According to the genetic survey data, around 95% of men there carry that R1b M269 marker we talked about a couple minutes ago. 95%. That's one of the highest concentrations of a single Y chromosome lineage recorded anywhere on the planet. And the Irish DNA Atlas study found this isn't just a Donegal thing. Across Ireland as a whole, the average sits around 84% of men. Similar numbers show up in Wales and in parts of Scotland too. Actually, hold on. Before I go further, this connects to something we covered in the last video, on the Iranian plateau. We talked about how the Zagros mountain corridor acted like a genetic funnel between Mesopotamia and the steppe. Here's the connection. The same steppe expansion that reshaped the gene pool on the Iranian plateau is, genetically, a cousin of the exact wave that ended up in Donegal. Two ends of the same Bronze Age movement, 6,000 kilometers apart, and both still show up clearly in the Y chromosomes of living people today. If you've ever taken one of those consumer ancestry tests and seen R1b listed under your paternal line, this is that line, not a metaphor. Not your ancestors were kind of like these people. This is that line. The R1b L21 branch specifically traces, generation after generation, no break in the chain. Through the Beaker arrivals we talked about, through the corded ware populations of Central Europe, back to the Yamnaya on the Pontic steppe. For something like 84% of Irish men, this isn't your ancestors were connected to the steppe migration. This is closer to, this is the steppe migration. Still going, still being passed down, still showing up in a lab report right now, today, for somebody. A lineage that started 2,500 miles away 5,000 years ago isn't some dusty fact in a museum case. It's the majority genetic signature of a living population. And most of those people have never been told. Here's what they weren't told, either. For most of the last century, the standard story of Irish origins went something like this. The Newgrange builders were the ancestors of the Irish. Then, much later, around 500 BCE, the Celts arrived, bringing language and culture. And Irishness was the sum of those two things. Jim Mallory, an archaeologist at Queen's University Belfast, has spent decades on exactly this question. And when he looked at what the genetic data was actually showing, the timeline didn't match the story at all. The major genetic shift, the one that gave most modern Irish people their ancestry, happened around 2500 BCE. The Beaker arrival, that's roughly 2,000 years before anything we'd call Celtic, by language or culture, shows up. And yet, the data said the exact opposite of what the old story assumed. The population that's genetically the ancestral majority of modern Ireland predates Celtic identity by 2,000 years. And the population that actually gave Ireland its language, the Iron Age, Celtic-speaking cultures, didn't add much new genetic material on top of what was already there. So you've got two different stories, a genetic story and a cultural story. And somewhere along the way, they got filed under the same folder. And the folder kept the newer, more romantic label, Celtic, even though genetically, that population is almost an afterthought compared to what came before it. Which means the population this whole video started with, the Newgrange builders, are sometimes the group that popular history actually does connect to the original Irish, while the population that supplied most of the actual modern gene pool gets folded into a Celtic identity that, genetically speaking, barely moved the needle. Two populations that most people assume are either the same group or back-to-back chapters of the same story turn out to be something closer to two separate stories. And somewhere along the way, the labels got swapped. One label never got applied at all. There's no popular name for the Neolithic farming population that built Newgrange and Noath and Douth. No household term, no flag. Nothing most people could name if you asked them. That same 2025 study, the one from the University of York and University College Dublin, that walked back the Incis King story, also confirmed something else. The people who built these monuments were descended from farmers who'd migrated from Anatolia, reaching Ireland around 3700 BCE, the very edge of a farming expansion that had been moving across Europe for thousands of years. Ireland was as far as it went. That population built one of the largest, most precisely engineered stone monuments in the world, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids at Giza, and within roughly 1,000 years, genetically, they were almost gone. Every winter solstice, people gather outside Newgrange before dawn. Irish visitors, people who've traveled from around the world. And as the sun rises, light moves down that narrow passage and fills the chamber inside, exactly the way it has for over 5,000 years. In honor of the people who built it, the chamber remembers them. The gene pool, mostly, doesn't. The monument that defines ancient Ireland for the entire world was built by a population that had almost no genetic descendants left within 1,000 years. And the population that came after them, the one that does carry forward, is the one standing outside, watching the light. If anyone's responsible for that, for the disappearance of that lineage, the genetic evidence doesn't point toward war. It doesn't point toward conquest. And what it does point toward is something the next part of this isn't going to let you look away from. Don't look away, look closer. Genome-wide studies of this transition across Atlantic Europe, including Britain and Ireland, have looked for evidence of large-scale violence lining up with this genetic shift. They haven't found much. David Reich's 2018 paper on the Beaker period transition in Britain points somewhere else entirely. Differential birth rates, possibly disease. Generations of intermarriage where, for whatever reason, one lineage simply had more success passing itself forward than the other. And honestly, that's harder to sit with than a story about conquest. There's no battle to point to, no single event you could mark on a timeline, Just generations, quietly accumulating, until one lineage is a footnote and the other is 84% of a population. Picture a child born in Ireland around 2300 BCE. Both ancestries already in their genome, Neolithic and Beaker, mixed together in one person. That child is the actual mechanism here. Not replacement by force. Absorption. Generation after generation, until one side of that mix statistically takes over the record. The witness to all of this isn't a written account. There's no inscription, no battlefield, no ruin that tells this story. The witness is a single mutation, the R1b marker itself, carried forward, mixed in, diluted, and eventually dominant. Inside the bodies of people who had no idea they were part of anything at all. And here's the last piece. None of those people needed to know what was happening for it to happen. Your ancestry, whatever it turns out to be, was shaped by all of this without anyone involved experiencing it as a story. The story only exists now, in retrospect, in a lab. A marker carried without ceremony through thousands of generations by people who never knew they were witnesses to anything, is sitting right now inside a lot of the people watching this. Finish watching then. It's the winter solstice. The sun is rising over the Boyne Valley, and inside the chamber at Newgrange, for about 17 minutes, light fills a space built by hands, belonging to a population that left almost no direct trace in the people standing outside it. Among that crowd, ordinary visitors, people who came for the sunrise, statistically, more of them carry that R1b marker than not. A population watching the work of a people who are genetically mostly gone. If you carry that marker, and if you've got Irish, Scottish, or Welsh ancestry watching this right now, the odds say you probably do. You're not a descendant of the people who built what you're picturing in your head. You're a descendant of whoever came after them and stayed. There's no single answer to who were the ancient Irish. There's just a sequence, each population absorbing the last, each one eventually becoming the ancient ones that some future population will, in turn, mostly replace. If this is the first one of these you've watched, this is what this channel does. Every place, every population, has a story this size sitting under a label that feels settled. If you want the next one, subscribing means you'll see it when it's ready. The monument is still there. The solstice still arrives on time. Everything else, who it was for, who gets to call it theirs, was never actually settled. It just stopped being asked.